Sometimes the dead speak louder than the living. I'm Miss Marple. Welcome to my new case.
The December wind rattled the diamond-paned windows of St. Mary Mead's parish hall with a persistence that suggested winter had truly arrived. Inside, however, warmth radiated from every corner where the annual winter banquet was in full swing, the air thick with the comforting scents of roasted fowl, mulled wine, and the particular mixture of lavender water and mothballs that seemed to follow the village ladies wherever they gathered. Miss Jane Marple sat quietly at a corner table, her knitting needles clicking in gentle rhythm as she worked on what appeared to be a baby's booty, though anyone observant might have noticed that her pale blue eyes spent considerably more time surveying the room than watching her stitches. She had that particular gift, developed over decades of village life, of appearing completely absorbed in her handiwork while actually cataloguing every gesture, every glance, every small social transaction occurring around her. The evening's host, Colonel Ashford, presided over the head table with military bearing, his weathered hands steady as he carved the ceremonial goose. He had returned to St. Mary Mead only 6 months prior, inheriting the family estate after years of service abroad, and the village was still taking his measure. Beside him, his ward, Catherine Fletcher, a pale, nervous young woman whose parents had died in a motor accident, picked delicately at her food, her dark eyes frequently darting toward the serving table where Thomas Hartwell, the doctor's son, was helping to distribute the wine. "Such a lovely turnout," murmured Mrs. Dollop, settling herself beside Miss Marple with the satisfied air of one who had contributed significantly to the evening's success. "Though I must say, there's been quite a bit of talk about the Colonel's intentions regarding the estate." Miss Marple's needles paused for just a moment. "Oh yes, dear. People do like to speculate, don't they? Rather like my nephew Raymond's mystery novels. Everyone thinks they know how it will end." Mrs. Dollop leaned closer conspiratorially. "Well, they say he's planning to sell up entirely, move to somewhere warmer, you know, his heart, apparently. Of course, that would leave poor Catherine quite at loose ends, and young Thomas—" She trailed off meaningfully. Miss Marple resumed her knitting, noting how Catherine's gloved hands trembled slightly as she reached for her wine-glass, and how Thomas Hartwell's usual cheerful demeanor had been replaced by something altogether more strained. She also observed that Dr. Hartwell himself, usually so attentive to his patients' needs, seemed oddly preoccupied, frequently checking his pocket watch as though expecting some urgent summons. The evening progressed with the comfortable predictability of village tradition. Speeches were made, toasts proposed, and the usual gentle gossip circulated like the warming punch. Miss Marple found herself particularly interested in the small drama unfolding at the head table, where Colonel Ashford's announcement about the estate's future had created undercurrents of tension that rippled through the seemingly placid gathering like stones thrown into still water. It was just past 9 o'clock when Colonel Ashford excused himself from the table, citing the need for fresh air after the rich meal. Miss Marple watched him make his way toward the side door that led to the small garden, noting the slight unsteadiness in his gait that might have been attributed to the wine, but which her experienced eye recognized as something altogether different. She was still pondering this when young Thomas Hartwell burst back through the garden door, his face white as the frost coating the windows, stammering words that would transform the cozy winter banquet into something far more sinister. "Dr. Hartwell, Father, please come quickly. The Colonel, I think he's dead." The knitting slipped from Miss Marple's fingers as the warm, cheerful atmosphere of the parish hall shattered like thin ice, replaced by the cold breath of murder that she had encountered too many times before in her seemingly peaceful village. The silence that followed Thomas's stammered announcement stretched like a held breath before shattering into the particular kind of controlled chaos that occurs when proper English villagers confront the improper reality of sudden death. Dr. Hartwell rose immediately, his weathered face shifting from the mild confusion of interrupted festivity to the focused concern of professional duty. He moved toward the garden door with swift, measured steps, Thomas trailing behind him like a shadow cast by lamplight. Miss Marple remained seated, her knitting forgotten in her lap, but her pale blue eyes tracked every movement, every reaction with the methodical attention of someone who understood that in moments of crisis, human nature revealed itself most clearly. The room around her buzzed with whispered speculation and nervous energy. Chairs scraping against wooden floors as people half rose from their seats, uncertain whether to follow or wait. Catherine Fletcher had gone even paler than before, if such a thing were possible, her gloved hands gripping the edge of the head table until her knuckles showed white beneath the fabric. Mrs. Dollop, never one to let a dramatic moment pass without commentary, was already leaning toward her nearest neighbor with the urgent whisper of someone who had long suspected such tragedy was inevitable. "His heart, you know," she murmured with the authority of one who collected medical gossip as diligently as she collected recipes. "I said only last week that he looked poorly. All that excitement about selling the estate, and at his age." Through the frost-covered windows, Miss Marple could see Dr. Hartwell kneeling beside a dark figure near the garden's central fountain. Even at this distance, the unnatural stillness of Colonel Ashford's form was unmistakable. The December moon cast sufficient light to illuminate the scene with stark clarity. The colonel lay beneath the ancient holly tree, one arm flung out as though he had reached for something just beyond his grasp. Young Thomas paced near the garden gate with the restless energy of extreme agitation, his breath forming small clouds in the bitter air. Miss Marple noted how he avoided looking directly at the colonel's body, his attention instead fixed on the gravel path as though studying some invisible pattern there. Dr. Hartwell reappeared in the doorway after what seemed an eternity but was likely no more than 10 minutes. His expression carried the careful blankness that medical men cultivate when delivering unwelcome news. The room fell silent immediately, every face turned toward him with that peculiar mixture of dread and anticipation that accompanies such moments. "I'm afraid Colonel Ashford has passed away," he announced, his voice steady but subdued. "It appears to have been quite sudden. I've asked Thomas to telephone for the police. Merely a formality in such circumstances, you understand. Most likely his heart simply gave out. The excitement of the evening, perhaps, or the cold air after the warmth of the hall." Miss Marple observed how quickly the assembled villagers seized upon this explanation, nodding with the relief of people offered a comfortable conclusion to an uncomfortable situation. Yet something in the scene troubled her, though she couldn't immediately identify what. Perhaps it was the way Thomas had looked when he burst through the door. Not merely shocked, but somehow guilty, as though he carried responsibility for more than just the discovery of the body. Catherine Fletcher's shoulders sagged with what might have been relief, and she pressed her handkerchief to her eyes in a gesture that seemed more performance than genuine grief. Several other villagers began murmuring their agreement with Dr. Hartwell's assessment, constructing a narrative of natural causes that would allow them to return to their comfortable routines without the unsettling implications of anything more sinister. "Poor man," sighed Mrs. Dollop, settling back into her chair with the satisfied air of one whose predictions had been vindicated. "Though I suppose there's mercy in it. He was dreading leaving the estate, you know. Felt it was abandoning his family duty." This observation struck Miss Marple as curious, given that her earlier conversations had suggested the colonel was quite eager to relocate to warmer climes for his health. She filed this contradiction away alongside her mental note that Colonel Ashford, a man of military precision in all matters, had chosen to take his evening air without his overcoat on such a bitter night. The sound of motor engines in the lane outside announced the arrival of the police, and Inspector Slack's familiar voice could be heard issuing orders to his constables. As the evening's festivities dissolved into official inquiry and somber speculation, Miss Marple continued her quiet vigil, watching the interplay of moonlight and shadow in the garden where Colonel Ashford had met his end. and wondering about the small inconsistencies that others seem so eager to overlook in their haste to embrace the most comfortable explanation. Inspector Slack arrived with the brisk efficiency of a man who preferred his mysteries solved before the paperwork grew cold, his coat collar turned up against the December wind that followed him through the parish hall doors. Miss Marple observed how his pale eyes swept the room with the particular satisfaction of someone who had already formed his conclusions during the short drive from the station. "Right then," he announced, removing his notebook with a flourish that suggested the matter would be resolved with admirable speed. "Dr. Hartwell, I understand we have a straightforward case of natural causes. Heart failure, I'm told." Dr. Hartwell nodded, though Miss Marple detected the slightest hesitation before he responded. "Yes, Inspector. The Colonel had mentioned some cardiac concerns recently. Nothing immediately threatening, but sufficient to make him consider relocating to a warmer climate for his health." This struck Miss Marple as curious, given that Colonel Ashford had appeared quite robust at Sunday service just the previous week, carrying the heavy collection plate without apparent difficulty. She filed this observation alongside her growing collection of small inconsistencies. Inspector Slack's questioning proceeded with mechanical thoroughness, his attention focused primarily on establishing a timeline that would support the natural death theory. When Thomas Hartwell recounted his discovery of the body, Slack showed little interest in the young man's obvious distress, concentrating instead on the practical details. "You went looking for him when exactly?" the inspector asked, pencil poised over his notebook. "Perhaps 20 minutes after he left the hall," Thomas replied, his voice carrying that same tremor that had marked his initial announcement. "Father suggested someone should check when he didn't return. The cold, you know." Catherine Fletcher, who had been sitting quietly with her hands folded, suddenly spoke up with unexpected authority. The Colonel was quite particular about his evening constitutional, Inspector. 15 minutes precisely, even in winter. It was a military habit he maintained religiously. Miss Marple found this observation fascinating, not merely for its content, but for the way it seemed to surprise both Dr. Hartwell and his son. Catherine's detailed knowledge of the Colonel's routines suggested a level of attention that went beyond casual acquaintance between guardian and ward. Inspector Slack, however, seized upon this information as confirmation rather than contradiction. There you have it. The old soldier maintained his discipline, but his heart couldn't match his determination. Unfortunate, but hardly mysterious. The assembled villagers murmured agreement, eager to embrace this comfortable conclusion. Mrs. Dollop was already speculating about funeral arrangements with the enthusiasm of someone who viewed such events as social opportunities. Yet Miss Marple noticed that several key figures remained notably silent during these discussions. As the inspector continued his perfunctory questioning, Miss Marple engaged in seemingly innocent conversation with various villagers. From young Penelope, who had been helping with the evening's preparations, she learned that the Colonel's plans to sell the estate had been common knowledge among the staff, though Catherine had seemed genuinely surprised by earlier references to it. She was terribly upset about the possibility, Penelope confided in hushed tones. The house meant everything to her, and she hadn't much else, you see. Just what the Colonel provided. Miss Marple tucked this information away alongside her observation that Catherine, despite her apparent grief, kept casting furtive glances toward Thomas Hartwell, who was growing increasingly uncomfortable under Inspector Slack's questioning. While the official formalities proceeded, Miss Marple drifted toward the garden door, ostensibly to retrieve her dropped knitting needle. Through the frost-covered glass, she could see the scene where Colonel Ashford had met his end, the ancient holly tree standing sentinel over the disturbed ground beneath its branches. Something caught her attention near the doorframe, a small dark smudge on the white-painted wood, positioned low near the bottom hinge where it might easily be overlooked in the general commotion. More intriguingly, she noticed that the frost on the garden path showed a confused pattern of footprints near the holly tree, but to one side, leading toward the old potting shed. lay an undisturbed sheet of crystalline white that gleamed like sugar in the moonlight. Whatever had happened in the garden, it seemed certain paths had remained untraveled. As Inspector Slack prepared to conclude his investigation with the satisfied air of a man whose expectations had been met, Miss Marple resumed her knitting with the gentle clicking of needles that had become the evening's most consistent sound. She had learned long ago that people revealed their truest selves not in their prepared statements, but in their unconscious reactions to unexpected questions and their assumptions about what others might or might not have noticed. The winter wind continued to rattle the windows, and Miss Marple reflected on how very often people believed what they found convenient, rather than what the accumulated evidence might actually suggest. Inspector Slack's methodical questioning proceeded with the satisfaction of a man whose suspicions were crystallizing into certainty. Miss Marple observed how his attention had begun to focus with laser-like intensity upon young Thomas Hartwell, whose obvious distress was being interpreted not as shock at discovering a body, but as the guilty conscience of someone with something to hide. "Now then, Mr. Hartwell," the inspector continued, his tone sharpening perceptibly, "you mentioned serving the mulled wine this evening. Can you tell me precisely how that was managed?" Thomas shifted uncomfortably, his hands clasping and unclasping at his sides. "We took turns with the ladle, Inspector. Mrs. Dollop asked me to take a cup specifically to the Colonel when he requested more during the toasts. The bowl wouldn't reach from where it sat." Miss Marple's knitting needles paused almost imperceptibly. From her position near the serving table, she had observed the evening's arrangements with the unconscious thoroughness of someone who noticed everything while appearing to notice nothing. The ornate silver ladle rested now in its bowl, and on the white cloth nearby lay several wine-stained rings where glasses had been placed. One ring, she noted, was notably deeper and more isolated than the others, positioned precisely where someone sitting slightly apart from the general company might have placed their cup. "And you served him personally?" Slack pressed, his pencil poised over his notebook with prosecutorial eagerness. "Yes, sir. I brought it directly to his place at the head table." Catherine Fletcher, who had remained silent during much of the questioning, suddenly spoke with unexpected authority. "The Colonel was most particular about his wine, Inspector. He always requested it be served quite warm, and he preferred to let it cool slightly before drinking. It was one of his habits." This observation struck Miss Marple as curious, not merely for its content, but for the way it seemed to surprise Dr. Hartwell, who glanced at his ward with something approaching bewilderment. Catherine's detailed knowledge of the Colonel's preferences suggested an intimacy of observation that went beyond casual acquaintance. Inspector Slack seized upon Thomas's role in serving the wine as confirmation of his growing theory. "So you had ample opportunity to ensure the Colonel received a cup prepared specifically for him, most convenient for anyone with malicious intent." "Inspector," Dr. Hartwell interjected sharply, "my son is hardly a poisoner. If you're suggesting, I'm suggesting nothing yet, Doctor," Slack replied smoothly, "merely establishing facts." His gaze returned to Thomas with renewed scrutiny. "I notice you have a mark on your right hand, lad. Care to explain how you came by it?" Thomas instinctively attempted to conceal his hand, but the damage was done. A fresh scratch, angry and red, marked his knuckles in a way that suggested recent contact with something rough or sharp. I caught it on the door frame earlier. Clumsy of me." Miss Marple found herself studying not just Thomas's injured hand, but Catherine's gloved ones, which remained folded with suspicious stillness in her lap. The black satin absorbed the lamplight, but along the edge of the right glove, she detected a faint, dark smear, as though it had brushed against something sooty and been hastily cleaned. "The door frame leading to the garden, perhaps?" Slack suggested with obvious satisfaction. "The same garden where you discovered Colonel Ashford's body." The implication hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Thomas's face flushed crimson as he struggled to find words that might exonerate him, but his obvious distress only served to deepen the inspector's conviction. Mrs. Dollop, who possessed an unerring instinct for shifting with prevailing winds, began to murmur about the impetuousness of youth and the dangerous passions that could drive young men to desperate acts. Her earlier certainty about natural causes evaporated like morning mist, replaced by the more dramatic possibility of murder most foul. Miss Marple continued her quiet observations, noting how Catherine's composure remained remarkably intact despite the growing accusations against Thomas, and how Dr. Hartwell's frequent glances at his pocket watch suggested an anxiety that went beyond concern for his son's predicament. Something about the evening's events troubled her deeply, though she couldn't yet articulate precisely what. As Inspector Slack prepared to escort Thomas to the station for more intensive questioning, Miss Marple reflected on the curious pattern of evidence that seemed almost too convenient in its clarity. In her long experience with human nature, she had learned that genuine guilt rarely announced itself so obviously, while calculated innocence often protested too much. The truth, she suspected, lay somewhere in the shadows between what appeared obvious and what remained carefully hidden. As Inspector Slack prepared to escort Thomas from the parish hall, Miss Marple rose from her corner table with the deliberate movements of someone who had reached a quiet decision. Her knitting bag clutched firmly in one hand, she approached the garden door with the innocent purpose of retrieving what appeared to be a forgotten handkerchief from the window sill. "If I might just collect my things, Inspector," she said mildly. "One does hate to leave personal items scattered about, particularly after such a distressing evening." Slack nodded impatiently, eager to conclude his business, while Miss Marple bent to examine the door frame with the careful attention of someone whose eyesight required close inspection. What she discovered there made her pause with genuine interest. The white-painted wood near the lower hinge bore a fresh, dark smear, the unmistakable residue of blacklead or graphite, applied recently enough to still gleam slightly in the lamplight. More significantly, when she tested the door's movement, it swung with perfect silence. This struck her as remarkably curious. Only the previous afternoon, during the ladies' auxiliary meeting, this very door had produced such an ear-splitting squeal that Mrs. Dollop had declared it worse than fingernails on slate. Yet tonight, when stealth might have been essential, it moved without the slightest sound. "Mrs. Dollop," Miss Marple called gently, "didn't you mention yesterday that someone really ought to oil this troublesome door?" Mrs. Dollop looked up from her animated discussion of Thomas's obvious guilt. "Oh yes, dear. Dreadful noise it made, though I suppose someone finally attended to it. About time, too." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, noting that Catherine Fletcher had gone quite still at this exchange, her gloved hands frozen in the act of folding her handkerchief. The young woman's composure, which had remained admirably intact throughout the evening's dramatics, showed its first genuine crack. As the inspector continued his preparations to depart with Thomas, Dr. Hartwell made a final, desperate attempt to defend his son. "Inspector, surely you must consider other possibilities. Thomas had no real motive for such an act." It was Catherine who responded, her voice carrying a tremor that might have been grief or something altogether different. "I'm afraid that's not entirely accurate, Dr. Hartwell. Thomas and we had hoped to marry. The Colonel's decision to sell the estate would have left me quite without prospects." This revelation struck the assembled company with varying degrees of surprise. Dr. Hartwell appeared genuinely stunned by news of his son's romantic attachment, while Mrs. Dollop's eyes brightened with the particular satisfaction of someone who had suspected such complications all along. Thomas's face flushed crimson as he stammered confirmation of their engagement, but Miss Marple found herself studying the supposed lovers with growing interest. In her extensive experience with village romances, genuine affection rarely displayed such careful restraint. Catherine's declarations seemed curiously rehearsed, while Thomas's obvious distress appeared to stem from something beyond mere romantic disappointment. More intriguingly, Miss Marple had observed the evening's wine service with her usual unconscious thoroughness. Thomas had indeed served the Colonel personally, carrying the mulled wine directly to the head table where it had been placed in the precise spot now marked by that isolated, deeper stain on the white cloth. Catherine's earlier comment about the Colonel's preference for allowing his wine to cool before drinking suddenly took on new significance. If the Colonel had maintained his military punctuality, 15 minutes precisely for his constitutional, and if he preferred his wine to cool before consumption, then the timeline everyone had accepted might be fundamentally flawed. Miss Marple recalled seeing no wine glass near the Colonel's body, yet if he had been poisoned by the drink Thomas served, surely he would have consumed it before venturing into the garden. "Catherine, dear," Miss Marple said with grandmotherly concern, "you mentioned the Colonel's particular habits regarding his wine. Did he typically finish his drink before taking his evening air?" Catherine's response came too quickly, with the practiced ease of someone who had anticipated such questions. "Oh yes, always. He was most methodical about such things." Yet Miss Marple noticed how Catherine's gloved hand unconsciously moved to her throat, where a delicate gold chain disappeared beneath her high collar. The gesture was protective, almost possessive, and spoke of secrets held close. Combined with the dark smear on her glove and her curious knowledge of door maintenance, these small details began forming a pattern that had nothing to do with young Thomas's supposed guilt. As Inspector Slack finally departed with his prisoner, Miss Marple remained by the garden door, her pale blue eyes reflecting the moonlight that illuminated the scene of Colonel Ashford's mysterious death. The obvious solution, she reflected, was often the most dangerous trap of all. The parish hall felt oddly cavernous once Inspector Slack departed with Thomas, the evening's warmth dissipating like smoke from extinguished candles. The remaining villagers began their exodus in hushed clusters, their earlier certainty about natural causes now replaced by the uncomfortable reality that murder had visited their peaceful community. Miss Marple remained, ostensibly helping with the cleanup while actually observing the subtle dynamics that emerged when people believed themselves unobserved. Dr. Hartwell stood beside Catherine Fletcher with the awkward solicitude of a man unaccustomed to offering comfort, particularly to a young woman whose romantic entanglements had caught him entirely by surprise. Catherine's composure, which had remained admirably intact throughout the evening's dramatics, finally showed signs of strain now that Thomas had been taken away. "My dear Catherine," Dr. Hartwell began hesitantly, "this business about you and Thomas, I must confess, I had no idea of your attachment." Catherine's response carried a brittleness that Miss Marple found telling. "We thought it best to keep our understanding private until Thomas had established himself professionally. The Colonel was particular about such matters." Miss Marple noted the careful pause before particular, as though Catherine had selected the word from several less flattering alternatives. More significantly, she observed that Catherine's supposed grief seemed curiously selective. Genuine distress at Thomas's arrest, certainly, but remarkably little sorrow for her guardian's death. While this exchange continued, Miss Marple made her way toward the garden door with the innocent purpose of retrieving what appeared to be a forgotten handkerchief. The December cold wrapped around her as she stepped outside, but she remained long enough to examine the scene with methodical attention. The frost had preserved the evening's events with crystalline clarity. Confused footprints near the holly tree, the suggestion of smaller steps placed carefully to avoid leaving distinct impressions, and most intriguingly, caught on a thorn at shoulder height, a tiny crescent of black fabric. No more than a sliver, but unmistakably satin. She did not disturb this evidence, returning instead to examine the doorframe itself. The dark smear near the lower hinge gleamed faintly in the lamplight. Graphite or blacklead, applied recently and somewhat hastily, judging by the incomplete coverage. This struck her as remarkably curious, given that yesterday this very door had produced such an ear-splitting squeal that Mrs. Dollop had declared it unbearable. "Penelope, dear," Miss Marple called gently to the young woman helping with the washing up, "you mentioned someone finally attended to that troublesome door?" Penelope looked up from her task, steam rising from the basin of soapy water. "Oh yes, Miss Marple. Miss Fletcher saw to it before everyone arrived this evening. Asked Mr. Pritchard for Blacklead from the harmonium cupboard. Said the squeak set her nerves on edge." This revelation struck Miss Marple as significant. Catherine's foresight in silencing the door suggested a level of preparation that went beyond simple household maintenance. "And the Colonel's wine cup?" she inquired conversationally. "I noticed how quickly it was cleared away. Miss Fletcher asked me to take it at once," Penelope replied. "Said he'd be cross to find it sticky later. I thought it odd, fetching it so quickly when he'd barely left the hall." Miss Marple's pale blue eyes grew thoughtful. Among the cups on the draining board, one rested inside another, as though to conceal which had been handled separately. The timeline everyone had accepted, that the Colonel had consumed poisoned wine before taking his constitutional, suddenly seemed problematic. If he had maintained his military punctuality of 15 minutes precisely, and if he preferred his wine to cool before drinking, as Catherine had claimed, where was the glass that should have been found with his body? Mrs. Dollop approached with an armload of plates, her face bright with the particular satisfaction of someone harboring significant gossip. "Such a shame about young Thomas," she sighed, "though I suppose one shouldn't be entirely surprised, given the family history." "Family history, dear," Miss Marple prompted gently. Mrs. Dollop's voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper. "Catherine's parents, of course. Dreadful scandal at the time. Her mother was engaged to Colonel Ashford himself before she ran off with that Fletcher fellow during the war. Broke his heart, they say. That's why he took Catherine as his ward. Guilt, perhaps, or old affection." This information transformed Miss Marple's understanding entirely. Catherine's intimate knowledge of the Colonel's habits, her desperate concern about the estate's sale, and most significantly, her position of trust despite no blood relation suddenly took on new dimensions. If the Colonel had once loved Catherine's mother, his guardianship might have been motivated by complex emotions rather than simple charity. "And recently," Mrs. Dollop continued, warming to her subject, "there's been talk that he'd grown distant from Catherine. Some say he'd discovered something that changed his feelings. The will, you know. Old Mr. Finch let slip that the Colonel had made significant changes to his bequests just last week." Miss Marple absorbed this revelation alongside her growing collection of observations. A young woman facing potential disinheritance, possessing detailed knowledge of her guardian's routines, demonstrating suspicious preparation for the evening's events, and showing curious composure in the face of supposed tragedy. The picture that emerged was far different from the grieving ward everyone assumed Catherine to be. As the cleanup continued, Miss Marple found herself studying Catherine with renewed interest. The young woman's gloved hands remained carefully controlled, but Miss Marple noticed how she avoided touching surfaces that might leave traces, and how her protective gesture toward her throat revealed the edge of what appeared to be an old-fashioned key on that gold chain. Perhaps the sort that might open a gentleman's private study or a locked drawer containing important documents like a recently revised will. The obvious solution, Miss Marple reflected as she gathered her knitting, was often the most dangerous trap of all. Inspector Slack had seized upon Thomas's guilt with the satisfaction of a man whose expectations had been confirmed, but the accumulating evidence suggested a far more calculated crime than a young man's passionate desperation could account for. The December morning dawned with that peculiar clarity that follows dramatic events, as though the very air had been purged of comfortable illusions. Miss Marple made her way through the frost-silvered lanes of St. Mary Mead with the measured pace of someone whose constitutional served purposes beyond mere exercise, her breath forming small clouds in the bitter air as she contemplated the inconsistencies that had multiplied rather than resolved with each passing hour since Thomas Hartwell's arrest. The news of the young man's imprisonment had spread through the village with characteristic efficiency, and already she could observe the subtle adjustments in social dynamics that occurred when scandal visited a peaceful community. Curtains twitched with unusual frequency, and the early morning shoppers clustered in hushed groups that dispersed with guilty haste when observed. Yet Miss Marple found herself increasingly troubled by the neat conclusion Inspector Slack had embraced with such satisfaction. Her destination was Ashford House, where she intended to offer condolences to Catherine Fletcher while observing the young woman's demeanor in the harsh light of morning sobriety. The Georgian mansion stood elegant against the winter landscape, its windows reflecting the pale sun like watchful eyes. Miss Marple noted that smoke rose from only the kitchen chimney, suggesting that the household had contracted significantly since the Colonel's death. Catherine received her in the morning room with composed courtesy that struck Miss Marple as remarkably theatrical. Dressed in deep mourning that emphasized her pallor, she presented the image of a grieving ward with precision that suggested careful preparation rather than spontaneous sorrow. "Miss Marple, how thoughtful of you to call during these difficult hours," Catherine said, her voice carrying exactly the right note of brave composure. Miss Marple settled herself with the deliberate movements of someone whose joints required consideration, placing her knitting bag strategically within reach. "Such a shock for everyone, dear. And poor Thomas. I'm certain this dreadful misunderstanding will be resolved promptly." Catherine's response proved illuminating. Rather than the eager agreement one might expect from a woman whose beloved had been wrongly accused, she displayed curious resignation. "I fear the evidence against him appears quite overwhelming, Miss Marple." Inspector Slack seemed thoroughly convinced of his conclusions. This fatalistic acceptance struck Miss Marple as oddly premature for someone supposedly devoted to the accused. In her extensive experience, genuine affection fought against adverse circumstances rather than accepting them with such philosophical calm. More significantly, Catherine's careful phrasing suggested she was already distancing herself from Thomas's fate. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Mr. Finch, the Colonel's solicitor, whose polished motor car announced the formal commencement of legal proceedings. He had arranged for the reading of the will, a customary formality that held particular significance given the previous night's tragedy. Miss Marple, invited as a long-standing family friend, accompanied Catherine to the Colonel's study with keen anticipation. Dr. Hartwell joined them, appearing considerably aged by his son's predicament, his usual professional composure replaced by the desperate anxiety of a father facing his worst fears. The study itself bore witness to the Colonel's methodical nature. Leather-bound volumes arranged with military precision, papers filed with meticulous care, and family photographs positioned at precise angles on the mahogany desk. Mr. Finch, a gentleman whose every utterance possessed the precision of his well-creased trousers, cleared his throat and began with the preliminary bequests. Modest sums to long-time staff members and charitable contributions to various village institutions. But then he paused, adjusting his spectacles with the deliberate care of someone preparing to deliver significant news. "It is essential to note," he stated with legal precision, "that Colonel Ashford executed substantial revisions to his last will and testament merely 3 days prior to his untimely demise." The collective intake of breath that followed was audible in the sudden silence. Catherine's already pale complexion became positively ashen, her gloved hands clenching almost imperceptibly in her lap. "In this revised document," Mr. Finch continued methodically, "the bulk of Colonel Ashford's estate, including this house and its contents, is bequeathed not to his ward, Miss Catherine Fletcher, but to the Royal Benevolent Fund for Retired Colonial Officers. Miss Fletcher is provided with a modest annuity, sufficient for comfortable maintenance, but constituting a fraction of the estate's total value." The revelation struck the small gathering like a physical blow. The simple, convenient motive Inspector Slack had constructed, that Thomas and Catherine sought to prevent the estate's sale to secure her inheritance, crumbled instantly. Catherine, far from being the primary beneficiary, had been virtually disinherited by her guardian's recent decision. Miss Marple watched Catherine's face with the attention of someone who understood that truth often revealed itself in unguarded moments. The young woman's initial shock gave way to something more complex. Not grief, but a subtle calculation that suggested this devastating news was not entirely unexpected. Mr. Finch continued with professional thoroughness. Furthermore, the Colonel made specific provision regarding his late wife's sapphire necklace, a family heirloom of considerable value. This piece was to be retrieved from his personal strongbox and bequeathed to his niece, Mrs. Eleanor Vance of Bath. The will explicitly states that the strongbox key was kept on a gold chain, which the Colonel habitually wore about his person. At this mention of the necklace and its associated key, Catherine's hand moved involuntarily to her throat, fingers pressing against the spot where Miss Marple had observed that telltale gold chain the previous evening. The gesture was protective, almost possessive, and far too revealing to be accidental. The implication struck Miss Marple with crystalline clarity. Catherine's intimate knowledge of the Colonel's routines, her suspicious preparation of the garden door, her curious composure following his death, and now her apparent access to his most private possessions painted a picture entirely different from the grieving ward everyone had assumed her to be. As Mr. Finch concluded the reading and prepared to depart, Miss Marple reflected on how completely the evening's apparent solution had been transformed. The murder was not about preventing a future sale of the estate, but about the immediate and catastrophic impact of a recently altered will. Thomas Hartwell, she now understood, had been a convenient scapegoat for a crime far more calculated and cold-blooded than anyone had yet imagined. The focus had shifted decisively toward Catherine Fletcher, whose carefully constructed facade of innocence was beginning to show dangerous cracks in the unforgiving light of legal revelation. The silence that followed Mr. Finch's departure stretched through Ashford House like morning mist, heavy with unspoken implications and the weight of shattered expectations. Miss Marple remained in her chair, ostensibly organizing her knitting while actually observing Catherine Fletcher's remarkable transformation from shocked ward to someone displaying an almost calculating acceptance of her reduced circumstances. Dr. Hartwell, whose distress had deepened with each revelation, attempted to offer what comfort he could. "Catherine, my dear, this must come as a devastating blow. Surely there must be some mistake, some legal recourse available to you." Catherine's response proved illuminating in its restraint. Rather than the passionate protest one might expect from someone genuinely surprised by such betrayal, she displayed a resignation that seemed oddly premature. "The Colonel had grown distant recently, Dr. Hartwell. Perhaps I should have recognized the signs of his changing affections." Miss Marple found this philosophical acceptance curious. In her extensive experience with human nature, genuine shock typically produced more volatile reactions than such composed regret. More significantly, Catherine showed little interest in pursuing the legal remedies Dr. Hartwell suggested, accepting her disinheritance with the equanimity of someone who had already made alternative arrangements. Their subdued conversation was interrupted by the return of Inspector Slack, whose earlier satisfaction at having solved the case so expeditiously now carried undertones of uncertainty. The revelation about the will had clearly complicated his neat theory about Thomas Hartwell's motive, though his determination to maintain his conclusions remained evident. "Miss Fletcher," he began with renewed formality, "I've come to discuss certain discrepancies that have emerged regarding Colonel Ashford's personal effects. Specifically, we've been unable to locate the key to his strongbox, which according to the will should contain items of considerable value." Catherine's reaction was immediate and telling. Her hand flew to her throat in that same protective gesture Miss Marple had observed repeatedly, fingers pressing against the spot where the gold chain disappeared beneath her high collar. "The key? I believe the Colonel was always very particular about keeping it secure." "Indeed," Slack continued, his attention sharpening. "Yet we found no such key among his effects last evening, most peculiar given that the strongbox in his dressing room appears to have been opened recently." The admission hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Dr. Hartwell looked up sharply, hope flickering in his eyes as the implications became clear. If the Strongbox had been accessed after the Colonel's death, then Thomas, who had been under observation or in custody since the body's discovery, could hardly be responsible. Miss Marple watched Catherine's face with the attention of someone who understood that truth often revealed itself in unguarded moments. The young woman's composure, which had remained admirably intact throughout the morning's revelations, showed its first genuine crack. I noticed the Strongbox was disturbed when I went to fetch a shawl this morning," Catherine said carefully. "I didn't think it significant at the time, given everything else that has happened." This explanation struck Miss Marple as remarkably convenient. Catherine's detailed knowledge of the Strongbox's condition suggested she had examined it with considerably more attention than a casual glance for a shawl would require. Moreover, her timing in discovering this crucial detail, just as Inspector Slack raised questions about the missing key, displayed a pattern of revelations that seemed almost too perfectly timed. "And the contents?" Slack pressed. "The sapphire necklace mentioned in the will?" Catherine's pause lasted a fraction too long, her eyes darting momentarily toward Miss Marple before returning to the inspector. "I'm afraid I couldn't say, Inspector. I didn't examine the contents closely. Such things seemed inappropriate under the circumstances." Yet Miss Marple noticed that Catherine's protestations of delicacy rang hollow when considered alongside her apparent comfort with examining the Colonel's private Strongbox at all. More tellingly, when she shifted in her chair, the faint outline of something substantial beneath her high collar became momentarily visible, something that caught the winter light with a distinctly crystalline gleam. As Inspector Slack prepared to examine the Strongbox personally, Miss Marple rose with the deliberate movements of someone whose joints required consideration. "Inspector, if I might suggest, in cases involving valuable jewelry, it's often worth examining whether any items have been moved for safekeeping. Young ladies, particularly in times of distress, sometimes take precautions with family heirlooms." The observation was delivered with such gentle concern that Catherine could hardly object. Yet Miss Marple noticed how the suggestion caused the young woman's composure to falter almost imperceptibly. The protective gesture toward her throat became more pronounced, and for the first time that morning, genuine alarm flickered in her carefully controlled expression. Dr. Hartwell, still focused on his son's predicament, seized upon this new development with desperate hope. "Then Thomas couldn't possibly be guilty of theft, Inspector. The timeline simply doesn't support such accusations." But Miss Marple found herself studying Catherine with growing certainty. The accumulated evidence, the silenced garden door, the intimate knowledge of the Colonel's routines, the suspicious timing of various discoveries, and now the missing necklace and Strongbox key, painted a picture of careful premeditation rather than passionate desperation. As Inspector Slack departed to examine the Strongbox, leaving Catherine and Dr. Hartwell to contemplate these new complications, Miss Marple reflected on the dangerous moment approaching. The young woman's carefully constructed facade of innocence was beginning to show fatal cracks, and soon she would be forced to make choices that would either preserve her deception or expose her guilt entirely. The challenge now was to guide events toward revelation without alerting Catherine to the growing certainty of her culpability. Miss Marple had learned long ago that confronting a clever murderer required infinite patience and the wisdom to recognize when someone's apparent cooperation masked far more sinister intentions than anyone had yet imagined. The afternoon light filtering through Ashford House's tall windows carried that peculiar quality of winter clarity that seemed to illuminate more than mere surfaces, revealing details that might otherwise remain hidden in shadow. Inspector Slack's departure to examine the Strongbox had left Catherine Fletcher and Dr. Hartwell in a state of anxious anticipation, though Miss Marple observed that their concerns seemed to stem from quite different sources. Dr. Hartwell paced the study with the restless energy of a father facing his worst fears, while Catherine remained seated with a composure that struck Miss Marple as increasingly theatrical. The young woman's gloved hands moved with careful precision, touching surfaces that might bear fingerprints, and her protective gestures toward her throat had become almost compulsive. When Inspector Slack returned, his expression carried the grim satisfaction of a man whose suspicions had been confirmed. "The strongbox has indeed been tampered with," he announced. "Window catch shows fresh marks, and the contents have been disturbed. The sapphire necklace is missing, along with several other valuable pieces." Miss Marple noted how Catherine's reaction seemed carefully calibrated. Appropriate shock without genuine surprise. More tellingly, when the inspector mentioned the missing jewelry, Catherine's hand moved instinctively to her throat, fingers pressing against the spot where something substantial clearly rested beneath her high collar. "How dreadful," Catherine murmured. The colonel was always so particular about security. He never removed that key from around his neck. This observation struck Miss Marple as curious. If Catherine knew the colonel's habits so intimately, she would also know that forcing a window would be unnecessary for someone with access to the key. The contradiction suggested knowledge that Catherine was trying very hard to conceal. Dr. Hartwell, grasping at hope for his son's exoneration, pressed the inspector about the timeline. Surely this proves Thomas couldn't be responsible. He was under observation or in custody when the strongbox was opened. But Inspector Slack had already formed his theory. The theft could have occurred during the evening's festivities while the house was unguarded. Young Hartwell had ample opportunity during his supposed search for the colonel. Miss Marple found herself studying the subtle interplay between Catherine and Dr. Hartwell. The young woman's passionate defense of Thomas regarding the murder charge had been notably absent when it came to the theft accusations. This selective loyalty suggested a more complex understanding of the evening's events than Catherine's protestations of ignorance would indicate. As the December afternoon progressed toward early dusk, Miss Marple engaged Catherine in seemingly innocent conversation about the colonel's habits and the household routines. Through careful questioning disguised as sympathetic interest, she learned details that troubled her deeply. The colonel was always so methodical about his evening constitutional, Miss Marple observed mildly. 15 minutes precisely, you mentioned, and that troublesome garden door, such foresight on your part to oil it before the guests arrived. One does hate squeaking hinges during social gatherings. Catherine's response came too quickly. Yes, the noise was quite unbearable. I asked young Penelope to fetch Blacklead from the harmonium cupboard. Miss Marple's knitting needles paused almost imperceptibly. She had observed Catherine's gloves throughout the day, noting the faint, dark smears that suggested recent contact with graphite or coal dust. More significantly, she had noticed how Catherine avoided touching light-colored surfaces that might show such traces. "How thoughtful of you, dear," Miss Marple continued with grandmotherly warmth. "And speaking of the colonel's treasures, I recall him showing me his late wife's sapphire necklace once, many years ago. Such an exquisite piece, with that distinctive antique setting. He was particularly proud of the central stone's unusual clarity. Quite flawless, as I remember." Catherine's reaction was immediate and telling. Her face went white, and her hand flew to her throat in a gesture that was purely protective. For someone who claimed ignorance of the necklace's whereabouts, she showed remarkable concern about its identifying characteristics. I wouldn't know about such details," Catherine stammered. "The colonel rarely discussed his jewelry with me." Yet Miss Marple had observed the distinctive gleam of sapphires catching the lamplight through the thin fabric of Catherine's high collar throughout their conversation. The missing necklace, she realized with growing certainty, was not missing at all. It was being worn by the very person who claimed ignorance of its location. "Of course, dear," Miss Marple said gently, her pale blue eyes holding Catherine's gaze with quiet intensity. "Though I do find it curious how often the most precious things are hidden in the most obvious places. Rather like my nephew Raymond's mystery novels. The solution is usually right there before us, if we only have the wisdom to see it. Catherine's composure finally cracked completely. The careful mask of grieving ward dissolved, replaced by the calculating expression of someone whose elaborate deception was crumbling around her. In that moment of unguarded reaction, Miss Marple saw the truth with crystalline clarity. Not the passionate desperation of young love, but the cold calculation of someone who had committed murder for gain and was prepared to let an innocent man pay the price. The stage was set for the final confrontation, where all the accumulated evidence would converge to expose the real killer who had turned a winter banquet into a scene of calculated death. The afternoon light filtering through Ashford House's tall windows had taken on that peculiar quality of winter twilight that seemed to sharpen every detail while casting longer shadows. Miss Marple observed how Catherine Fletcher's carefully maintained composure from the morning had begun to show hairline cracks, like fine porcelain subjected to sudden temperature changes. The revelation about the will had shifted the entire foundation of the case, and now the accumulated weight of inconsistencies demanded resolution. "Catherine, dear," Miss Marple said with the gentle authority that had served her through countless village crises, "I believe we must have a more thorough discussion about yesterday evening's events. Inspector Slack will return shortly, and I fear some details may require clarification before then." Dr. Hartwell, still grappling with hope for his son's exoneration, looked between the two women with growing awareness that undercurrents he had missed were finally surfacing. Catherine's response came with forced lightness that fooled no one present. "Miss Marple, I've told you everything I know about the Colonel's death. Surely there's nothing more to discuss." Miss Marple resumed her knitting with deliberate precision, her pale blue eyes never leaving Catherine's face. "Perhaps we might reconstruct the evening's events more carefully. Small details often prove illuminating when examined in proper sequence." She paused, allowing the suggestion to settle before continuing with deceptive mildness. "For instance, that troublesome garden door. Yesterday afternoon it produced such an ear-splitting squeal that Mrs. Dollop declared it unbearable. Yet last evening, when stealth might have been essential, it moved in perfect silence. Such thoughtful preparation, oiling it with blacklead just hours before the banquet." Catherine's gloved hands tightened almost imperceptibly in her lap. The noise was simply irritating. I asked Penelope to fetch Blacklead from the harmonium cupboard as a matter of household maintenance. "Of course, dear," Miss Marple agreed pleasantly, "though I notice your gloves still bear traces of that same Blacklead. Curious for someone who merely requested the task rather than performing it personally." The observation struck Catherine like a physical blow, her eyes darting involuntarily to her hands before she forced them to stillness. Dr. Hartwell leaned forward with dawning comprehension as Miss Marple continued her gentle interrogation. "Then there's the matter of timing. You mentioned the Colonel's military precision, 15 minutes exactly for his constitutional. Yet young Penelope cleared away his wine cup almost immediately after he left the hall. If he had consumed poisoned wine, surely he would have done so before venturing into the December cold." Catherine's face had gone pale, but she maintained her defensive posture. "Perhaps he took the cup with him. The Colonel sometimes did unusual things when distracted." Miss Marple's knitting needles paused with telling emphasis. "But no cup was found with his body. And you, dear, seem remarkably well informed about his habits for someone who claims distant relations with her guardian. His preference for cooled wine, his exact constitutional timing, even his personal effects." The psychological pressure was building with inexorable force, each gentle observation tightening the net of evidence around Catherine's increasingly desperate position. Miss Marple's voice remained conversational, almost grandmotherly, as she delivered each devastating point. "Speaking of personal effects, there's the curious matter of the Colonel's Strongbox key. According to Mr. Finch's reading, it was kept on a gold chain that the Colonel wore constantly. Yet it wasn't found on his person, and the Strongbox had been opened. Most peculiar, wouldn't you agree?" Catherine's hand flew instinctively to her throat, fingers pressing against the spot where something substantial clearly rested beneath her high collar. The gesture was purely protective and far too revealing to be accidental. I wouldn't know anything about the Colonel's private arrangements, Catherine stammered, but her voice carried the brittle edge of someone whose carefully constructed defenses were crumbling. Miss Marple set down her knitting with deliberate finality. My dear Catherine, I think perhaps you know a great deal more than you've shared. The sapphire necklace mentioned in the will, for instance, the one with the distinctive, flawless central stone that the Colonel was so proud of. I believe I can see its gleam through your collar even now. The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Catherine's composure finally shattered completely, her face contorting with a mixture of rage and desperate calculation. The grieving ward disappeared entirely, replaced by someone whose sense of entitlement had been transformed into something far more dangerous. You don't understand, Catherine said, her voice carrying the harsh edge of someone whose world had collapsed around carefully laid plans. He was going to destroy me. After everything I'd done, everything I'd sacrificed. Dr. Hartwell stared at her with dawning horror as the implications became clear. Miss Marple watched with the sorrowful attention of someone who had witnessed too many human tragedies born of desperation and greed. The winter banquet's innocent festivity had indeed concealed calculated murder, and the truth was finally emerging from the shadows where it had hidden behind masks of grief and misdirection. The confession that had begun to spill from Catherine Fletcher's lips hung in the winter air like a bell struck in gathering darkness, its reverberations spreading through the study with the terrible finality of truth finally spoken. Her carefully constructed facade had crumbled entirely, revealing the desperate woman whose sense of entitlement had transformed into something far more deadly than anyone had imagined. You don't understand what he did to me, Catherine continued, her voice carrying the bitter edge of someone whose world had collapsed around carefully laid plans. 20 years I devoted to this house, to his comfort, to maintaining the fiction that I was grateful for his charity, and then, 3 days ago, he summoned me to this very room and told me the truth, not just about selling the estate, but about what he'd discovered regarding my parents. Miss Marple's knitting needles paused with deliberate emphasis as she absorbed this revelation. Your mother's relationship with him before her marriage to your father. He felt betrayed twice over, once by her abandonment, and again by what he saw as your deception in accepting his guardianship. Catherine's laugh carried no warmth, only the brittle sound of someone whose carefully laid plans had been exposed. He called me the daughter of a faithless woman, said he'd been a fool to burden himself with such a legacy. The revised will was his final punishment, leaving me with barely enough to survive while his precious charity received everything. Dr. Hartwell stared at her with dawning horror, finally comprehending the depth of calculation that had been hidden beneath her composed exterior. Miss Marple continued with the gentle but inexorable pressure that had served her through countless village crises. So you decided to act before the will could be formally executed. The winter banquet provided the perfect opportunity, a crowded gathering where suspicion would naturally fall elsewhere. Miss Marple's pale blue eyes held Catherine's gaze with quiet intensity. You prepared meticulously, didn't you, dear? The garden door that squealed so dreadfully yesterday was silenced with blacklead from the harmonium cupboard. Your gloves still show the traces. Catherine's hands trembled as she looked down at the dark smears along the seams of her black satin gloves, evidence she had forgotten in her careful planning. Then there's the matter of timing, Miss Marple observed mildly. You mentioned the Colonel's military precision. 15 minutes exactly for his constitutional, yet young Penelope cleared away his wine cup almost immediately after he left the hall. If he had consumed poisoned wine, surely he would have done so before venturing into the December cold, but no cup was found with his body. The psychological pressure was building with inexorable force. each gentle observation tightening the net of evidence around Catherine's increasingly desperate position. Miss Marple's voice remained conversational, almost grandmotherly, as she delivered each devastating point. "You followed him into the garden through the silenced door, didn't you? Perhaps you told him there was something urgent requiring privacy, a final appeal about the will, or news that couldn't wait. He went willingly, trusting his ward of 20 years. Miss Marple paused, allowing the implication to settle. But confrontation turned to something more desperate when he refused to reconsider his decision. Catherine's face had gone ashen, her protective gesture toward her throat becoming almost compulsive. "He was so frail," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "When I grabbed him, tried to make him listen, his heart simply couldn't bear the shock. I never meant for him to die, only to understand what he was doing to me." Miss Marple nodded with sorrowful understanding. A man with a weak heart, subjected to sudden physical and emotional stress on a bitter winter night. The struggle left its traces. That small tear in your cloak where it caught on the hollythorn, the confused footprints in the frost near where he fell. And then you took the key from around his neck, didn't you? The one that opened his strongbox. The sound of Inspector Slack's motor car in the drive announced the arrival of official justice, but Miss Marple continued her gentle interrogation. "You accessed the strongbox either in the small hours or at dawn, taking the sapphire necklace that you felt was rightfully yours. The window catch shows fresh marks where you staged a break-in to cover your tracks. But if you had truly discovered the disturbance this morning, as you claimed, you would have raised an alarm immediately." Catherine's composure finally shattered completely as Inspector Slack entered the study. Her hand flew to her throat, where the distinctive gleam of precious stones caught the lamplight through her collar. With trembling fingers, she unfastened the hidden necklace, the sapphires spilling onto the Colonel's desk like drops of frozen twilight. "It should have been mine," she said hoarsely, her voice breaking with 20 years of suppressed resentment. "I was more daughter to him than any blood relation could have been. After everything I sacrificed, everything I endured, to be cast aside because of something my mother did before I was even born." Inspector Slack stepped forward with the grim efficiency of a man whose earlier certainty had been thoroughly overturned. "Catherine Fletcher, I arrest you for the murder of Colonel Ashford and the theft of his personal property." As the constable led Catherine away, her rigid composure finally giving way to desperate tears, the winter darkness settled over Ashford House like a shroud. Dr. Hartwell sat in stunned silence, processing the revelation that would free his son while condemning a young woman he had known since childhood. Miss Marple gathered her knitting with a satisfied air of a problem properly solved, though her expression remained touched with infinite sadness. "The tragedy, Dr. Hartwell, is that she might have contested the will through proper legal channels. 20 years of devoted service carries considerable weight in such matters. Her desperate act has transformed what might have been a civil dispute into something far more terrible." The following morning brought news of Thomas Hartwell's release, his innocence established beyond doubt. The village buzzed with shocked whispers as the true story emerged, but gradually, as Miss Marple had predicted, St. Mary Mead would return to its comfortable routines. The winter banquet would be held again next year, though perhaps with a trace more caution in its kindness. In her cottage that evening, Miss Marple sat by the fire, her knitting needles clicking rhythmically as snow began to fall outside her windows. She reflected on the sad tragedy of human nature, how pride and desperation could transform devoted service into calculated murder, and how the most obvious solutions often concealed the most complex truth. The winter banquet had indeed ended in death, but justice, she reflected with quiet satisfaction, had ultimately prevailed through careful observation of the small details that revealed the larger patterns of human behavior. The parish hall would host future gatherings, and life would continue its gentle rhythm, but the memory of that December evening would linger as a reminder that beneath the surface of even the most peaceful communities, The eternal struggles of human nature continued to unfold, waiting for someone with the wisdom to observe, understand, and ultimately reveal the truth hidden in the shadows of deception.